Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and let's get this right out of the way. I have been tasked with encouraging you, if you listen to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, and if you enjoy the Thomas Jefferson Hour, even when we mess up or present opinions you might not agree with.
You know, and other public radio programs say we are supported by listeners like you, and that is certainly the case, that we don't take any money, you or I, from this, although the barn needs some work.
There was you had a very controversial essay. It was great about 3-4 weeks ago.
About what?
It was a big one.
Property or money or something?
Yeah, anyway, and a lot of discussion goes on social media. I rarely ever go on social media, but I get notifications anyway. So I went there, and one of the guys who really disagreed with that essay, kind of got threatening in.
Really?
Do you guys receive any government funding or grants?
We'll shut you down.
I'm going to take my tax dollars away from you, Jefferson Hour. We don't get any of that. We don't have a corporate sponsor, and a month doesn't go by when we get a couple of inquiries whether or not we'd like one. We have no government grants. It costs us money to put the show up on the public radio satellite system. Neither Clay and I. Neither one of us take a salary for this.
And it shows.
It's not that
too.
we don't. It's not that we don't benefit from it, because we do. You're begging for presidents,
and some people send them to me, and they, you know what they say? We don't listen to Swenson. We want to send you this gift. We want to send you this gift.
No, wait a minute. I was getting somewhere with this. The point is that if we don't get listener support, we can't do this. I just want to say.
Yeah, we don't want to sound like televangelists. If you want to.
Was I getting close to that?
No, but
I'm better than I thought.
We could stray into this.
No. Let me wrap it up. Let me just
the apocalypse is coming.
No, I just want to thank those of you who have decided to support the Jefferson Hour. It's your money. You get to do whatever you want with it, and if you choose to send something to us to help keep the show going, we really appreciate it. If you don't, and you'd like to, simply go to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate. You can join the 1776 Club. I think the low level is like $5 a month, and you get additional content, some audio books, some out of episode stuff where we kind of let loose, and or you can make a donation, and we really appreciate it. And with that, I am done for the pitch this week. It's all yours.
Well, let me pitch on the cultural tours. We're going to go back to Cuba next year around this time.
That was a great show last week. Yeah.
I mean, I am going back to Cuba as many times as I can, and now I'm really going to read about the revolution and about the San Juan Hill and about Jefferson's obsession with
my
Florida
business
and the
partner,
Cubans.
The guy who runs the studio with me, Mike.
Yes.
He's been to Cuba.
I did not know that.
Yes, he went on a tour. I don't know, 5 years ago. Anyway, he's quite interested in this, and I think he might like to go again. He was just taken by Cuba.
It is a very extraordinary place. Then there are the winter encampments next January. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the 10th through the 15th of January at Locksaw Lodge.
This is, yes, it's
the atomic bomb.
Not like you're out in tents. You're at this great
No, it's a luxury lodge.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. The temperature's 40 degrees, and it snows a little. Then there's one on Thoreau and Walt Whitman on the 17th through the 22nd of January 2021. And then in March, our Steinbeck trip, our third Steinbeck in California trip, and then in the summer, Lewis and Clark. And we're already talking about now going to Greece. And Wayne Fairchild, our Lewis and Clark outfitter, extraordinary man. I just want to say something about him, David, if I may. I've worked with Wayne for a long, long time. And I love him and know him really well. But I didn't know this. He goes to Cuba now twice a year, and he takes a second suitcase filled with things like shampoo and tampons and backpacks and tennis shoes and so on. And he gives them to people on the street because the Cubans need so many basic things. He never asks for gratitude.
What a guy.
He just says, here, and hands somebody a backpack or hands women personal hygiene products, which they need. They cannot get in Cuba. And so he does this. He always takes an extra suitcase, and he goes out of his way to show his gratitude for being welcomed into Cuba by bringing things of absolute need for them and the things that you can buy in any Kmart or Walmart or other,
What a good
dollar
guy.
store in this country. And so anyway, we're going back to Cuba, and he and I are going to go to Greece. He wants to join me on my Homeric trip to Greece, and he's never been, so in this case, I'll be the expert.
You should probably take your daughter to make sure you keep things straight.
Wow, really?
Well, I've heard about some of those other trips that you had with her. Anyway,
Wow.
So, she would like that, and
she'd be
she would
great.
agree with me.
She'd be great.
So we want to thank especially those of you who have taken time to send questions in to President Jefferson. Now, we had a listener who sort of shamed us into recognizing that we hadn't done as much speaking with President Jefferson in the past year. So
And how about audio
we talked to
questions?
him. We've talked to him like 3 times.
We're trying to do more.
In the last month.
Well, what about the audio questions?
Well, they're there.
They're piling up.
And I don't know. I'd have to talk to the web elf and find out.
Well,
So-
I think they are, and then we love written questions, and we have not forgotten our conservative commentator.
Yeah, that's in your hands.
I know.
We've got a couple guys.
I've been out of the country, but I'm glad for this. I really want this perspective.
Me too. And we can get that set up.
And before we go to the show, I just want to say that today's Jefferson Watch is a shortened version of something I wrote on Facebook, which you can find there. It's about Greta Thunberg, who came to North Dakota. She came to the Standing Rock Indian Reservation, which was the site of that catastrophe and controversy around the DAPL pipeline. And a local wet plate photographer took her portrait, and he intended to mount it on the side of a building in downtown Bismarck. And this has led to an extremely silly controversy. And I just want to say that I am for art and for free speech. And so if you want to know more about this issue, just go to the New York Times or Google Greta Thunberg, North Dakota, and you'll see.
Or go to jeffersonhour.com. They'll be, I'm sure.
We'll put it up there too. But it's really important because we are moving into a kind of a new dark ages in some ways in this country, and we have to speak up. All of us have to speak up for freedom of expression.
And many other things. So with that, thank you all very much for your contributions to the show and your questions to the president.
Thank you, everyone. See you on the trail.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar, author, and creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me now is President Thomas Jefferson, and good to see you, sir.
Good day to you, my dear citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, as always, I have a stack of questions from your many listeners. Before we go there, though, I wanted to just touch on a favorite subject of mine, which you are always ready to indulge me in, and that is gardening, sir. I'm so happy to let you know that it's begun in a small way for me, even though it's early in the season where I live. I do have some seeds in the ground indoors.
Well, indoors, I should hope. I'm told by Meriwether Lewis that your climate is rugged.
Yes, it is. It's as you know from his journals, sir. It's not unusual at this time of year to have temperatures way below zero, sir.
Now, we plant virtually 12 months per annum at Monticello, certainly beginning in February. When can you safely plant lettuce or peas or tomatoes in your Dakota?
Well, lettuce and spinach, greens, they're a colder weather crop. And this year, I actually, in the fall of the past year, planted some greens to let them winter and then see if they'll come up first thing in the spring.
Well, surely they'll be killed by the frost.
Well, I don't know. Many people do this. I probably should talk to an expert gardener. There's one at your garden in Monticello by the name of Pat Brodowski. I'm certain she could give me good advice.
Well, I would hope so, but we have the ideal climate. I think nowhere in the world can you match this part of Virginia. We get more than 40 inches of rain per year. It comes in a timely fashion. The soils are rich. The sun is hot. The sky is frequently without clouds. I would rather live in my part of Virginia than anywhere else in the United States, with the possible exception of Pennsylvania.
Of course, I'm sure you would agree with me that the joy, of course, is to harvest the plants, but it's more in watching them grow, the miracle of plants from tiny seeds.
Of course, each seed is different, and these tiny little seeds produce extraordinarily different foliage and flowering and fruit. To think that you can grow a rutabaga alongside an onion, alongside a pumpkin, next to sweet corn, first grown by the Mandans up in the upper Louisiana territory. This is an amazing thing, that out of these small little atoms can come such different sorts of plants with different tastes and different colors, different growing seasons, and often your tomatoes will fail, but your cucumbers are extraordinary, or your cucumbers don't do very well that year, but your squashes and pumpkins are exceedingly fruitful.
Well, it's a very satisfying thing to do, sir. Let's move on to some of the questions we've received, if we might.
Of course.
The first one comes from a gentleman, Rick Flint. He writes, I suggest that the more power within a government is dispersed, the less likely it is the government will be able to accomplish anything meaningful. Because the founders apparently did not anticipate the rise of political parties, our current system of government cannot be adequately analyzed in terms of what was intended. Do you agree?
Well, there are two parts to that. First, the idea of diffusion of power. That's my concept, that when you concentrate power or money or anything else in the hands of one, it's frequently badly employed and often leads to corruption. But if you diffuse power or money or property among a large number of people, that it's much more likely to be responsibly employed. And so diffusion of power makes sense to me. That's why in our national government we're fortunate. We have three branches of the national government, and within the main branch, the legislative, we have two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and they distill the will of the people in somewhat different ways. And once each of them has made a determination about public policy, there must be a reconciliation of those two approaches between the House of Representatives and the Senate. And if the president thinks that the bill is irresponsible or unconstitutional, the president can veto that bill, and so on. So I do believe diffusion works, and I will add another element to that. We are a dual sovereign in the United States. We have federal system in which the national government is sovereign in some limited respects, but the states are sovereign in more important respects. And so even if the national government does something, the states can remonstrate or can provide variations with their own jurisdictions. So that's a check against national power. So that's the first part of this question. I do believe very strongly in diffusion. Now, it's possible that that kind of diffusion of sovereignty and power was more useful in the 18th century than it is in yours, because we lived in a much simpler, more agrarian, more peaceful, and a slower-paced era. So that kind of delay in government efficiency, which was central to our concept of checks and balances, may in some regards impede you at a time when the pace of life travels not at 3 miles per hour, but in some cases at 186,000 miles per second. So that's worth, I think, considering. As to the rise of parties, the Founding Fathers made one terrible mistake, and that is they devised a new constitution for the United States hoping and assuming that we could be a nonpartisan nation. That failed. Almost immediately, factionalism began to spring up, and the party that created the government, the Federalist Party, was opposed by those who felt that that was too centralized, too militaristic, too commercial in activity, and that was the anti-Federalists, which later became known as the Jeffersonian Republicans or the Jeffersonian Republican Democrats. And so Mr. Madison and I somewhat inadvertently played a role in helping to build a two-party system. We did it merely because we felt that the party that had created the Constitution, the party of Washington, Adams, and Hamilton, had too little respect for the people, too little respect for what emerged as a democracy a few decades later, and we felt that they must be retired or they would move us down a path of monarchy and English-style class system.
At the end of his question, he says our current system of government cannot be adequately analyzed in terms of what was intended, and blames this on the Founding Fathers not anticipating this political rivalry.
He's right.
What was intended? I mean, my take is that the founders intended to give us a framework so that our government would work properly. Government
as umpire, essentially. Free enterprise and individual initiative would do most, and then the government would serve as an impartial jurist or umpire in disputes between states or disputes between sections or developing our foreign policy and so on. Later in life, I came to believe that factionalism is probably a part of human nature. In other words, let's say that on day one of a new constitution, you had 100% consensus. Probably 2 years later, there is a faction which opposes that consensus. Humans seem to be, I'm sorry to say it, inherently disputatious, inherently likely to fracture. And I always worried that the triumph of one party, say if my Jeffersonian Republican Party became too dominant, that would just mean that we would fissure in and of ourselves, that my party would fracture and factions would grow within it, one that was for more fiscal responsibility and one for less fiscal responsibility, one that wanted to tilt towards England in our foreign policy and one that wanted to continue to embrace France. That this sort of notion that humans must disagree, that fractionalism is somehow either a very bad habit that we're having a hard time overcoming or that it's actually inherent in human societies. That's such an upsetting thought to me. But I realize that that's probably the case, and that means that the Founding Fathers were in error when they devised a system that was intended never to have political parties or factions. And in two areas, this really matters. There are many more, but I'll specify two. One is the creation of the presidency. So under the original system, the person who got the most number of electoral votes was president, and the runner-up was vice president. And that meant that in the second administration, when John Adams was president, I became his vice president, even though we disagreed about almost every public policy. And so already the system had begun to break down, and we had to adjust it with the 12th Amendment, which changed the nature of the election system for the president and the vice president. And the second area is impeachment. You've just seen it in your own time. The idea was that the House would be closer to the people, more volatile, more likely to distrust, and the House would impeach a national officer like a president or a Supreme Court justice. That would be a sort of an indictment. And then the Senate would sit as a completely impartial jury. The Senate would have no politics. The Senate would just be a group of wise individuals who had a more sober and cautious view of things than the House could ever have. And they would sit in dispassionate judgment of the offense of the person who had been impeached by the House of Representatives. And so what you want is a Senate that behaves like a jury in a criminal or civil case. But in fact, as you know, the Senate is just as politicized in your era as the House of Representatives, and it can't possibly sit as an impartial jury because party politics are at least as important as impartiality. So my idea that they gave us a framework, as you put it, an umpire for government, you hold to that? I do, but you're going to have to make some adjustments the next time you amend your Constitution to make it resonate with the way the world actually operates, not the way you would like it to operate. Well, surely you must have seen this coming. The founders must have seen this coming and anticipated impeachments, etc. Yes. First of all, there was regional factionalism. So the South was very different from the Northeast, and it found itself at odds with the New Englanders who were embracing what was coming of the Industrial Revolution, who had small farms, no slaves in most cases, or slavery was certainly abolished early in the history of New England under our Constitution. And so we had that regional problem of sectionalism. And then there were disputes between different states and different ways of organizing the economy. And then on top of that, the party system had emerged. I'd like to thank Mr. Flint for that question. Right now, sir, we need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to
the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Welcome back, Mr. Jefferson.
Thank you, citizen.
I have another question for you, sir. This one comes from Stephen the Heron, and it's about the White House. He writes, in 1909, the Oval Office opened in the White House, where it is the workplace for the President of the United States. During your time as President of the United States, where did you do your work in the White House, sir?
I added the West Wing when I was president. I like these wings. You'll see them at Monticello and also at my second home at Poplar Forest, and I knew that we were going to need more space for the even modest government that I presided over between 1801 and 1809. Meriwether Lewis was my first secretary, my first presidential private secretary, and I housed him in what you call the East Room. We actually divided it in two. It's a very large room, and he had his private quarters in one part of it, and then his office was in the second part of it. So he was the East Room, and after he came back from his famous tour, the artifacts that he brought, we put down on the carpets of the East Room and examined them along with maps. My office at the time was in what you now call the State Dining Room, and if you go to the world of the White House on your internet, you can see a painting of my office that has bookshelves, and it has my pet mockingbird Dick in a cage.
Is that accurate? The stories of this bird
Yes.
sitting on your shoulder and you feeding it?
Yes, Margaret Bayard Smith, my dear friend, wrote about it. Dick was a mockingbird. I used to let him fly freely when I was alone or with just a few in what you call the White House, and he did sometimes sit on my shoulder while I worked. He brought great cheer to me, and there were occasions when I would put him on my finger and let him chew little crumbs from my lips, or we would have this moment of community together. And so yes, he would hop up the stairs and so on. Some people find birds in enclosed places a little frightening, so I sometimes had to cage him. He was a very obedient bird, and yes, so his name was Dick, and you can see a painting of him in the State Dining Room in his cage while I'm working on a conversation with Meriwether Lewis.
You had a window plant in that office as well, didn't
Geranium, yes. I had some planters because I love to grow things, but Margaret Bayard Smith again, the wife of the editor of the National Intelligencer, which was the main newspaper in Washington, D.C., she, how do I put this carefully, had a kind of a platonic crush on me, and she liked to spend time with me and loved it that I took such delight in little things like flowers and planting things and so on. So when I was leaving the presidency in the spring of 1809, I gave her a geranium as a parting gift of affection, and she said that she would treat it as a great treasure and would make sure that it grew luxuriantly and so on. So yes, I said at one point, no sprig of grass grows uninteresting to me. Whenever I see something growing, it gives me a sense that we live in a world of fecundity and fertility, that nature, with a capital N, and nature's God, as I put it in the Declaration of Independence, wanted humans to thrive, to live in comfort, at least subsistence plus, and that this was a benevolent God or celestial being, and that nature with a capital N is where fundamental law comes from. And when humans observe nature and discern its laws, gravitation, seasonality, centrifugal and centripetal force, etc., when you observe those laws, they make you saner, and they make it more likely that your legislative actions, your positive laws, will be in harmony with nature and nature's law.
Very good, Mr. Jefferson. You mentioned Meriwether Lewis in your last answer, sir, and we received a question from Mr. James Norton. He writes, could you discuss Meriwether Lewis's appointment as governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory?
Yes, of course. When I became president, I knew that I would need a private secretary and an aide-de-camp. Mr. Lewis's parents were friends of mine. His father had died, unfortunately, during the course of the Revolutionary War. His mother, Lucy, was a good friend of mine, and she actually supplied hams and turkeys for the tables at Monticello. And young Lewis, who was young enough to be my son — I did not have a living son — had approached me as a young man wanting to go on one of the expeditions that the American Philosophical Society was contemplating for the West. I felt he was too young at the time, and that expedition collapsed for other reasons. But I remembered him, and when I became president, I knew that he was a captain in the Army and that he was a recruiting officer and a paymaster out in the Ohio country, in the Illinois country. And so I wrote to him and said, would he be willing to come serve with me in the White House and live there too, by the way, as part of my family, but to serve as my private correspondence secretary. And he agreed to do that. And I then trained him for all of the things that I had in mind with respect to exploring the Missouri country. And he led that expedition between 1804 and 1806 with extraordinary skill, losing only one man in that from natural causes, mapping the West, attempting to determine latitude and longitude. He brought back many specimens of plants and animals and minerals. It was a very, very extraordinary success as an exploration party. I wanted to reward Mr. Lewis and also the other men of the expedition, including his subaltern, William Clark. So I suggested a compensation package to Congress, and one of the rewards for Mr. Lewis was that I appointed him to be the governor of Upper Louisiana, to be stationed in St. Louis, and he was approved by the United States Senate. He went there. He was somewhat dilatory in getting there, and he had a very difficult experience there for lots of different and important reasons. And because of that, he never finished the report, the 3-volume book project that he had been contemplating. And that, of course, was a source of deep disgruntlement and disappointment to me. So I appointed him to that office as a reward and frankly was grooming him for still greater things. And I know it may sound odd for me to say this, but if he had been a very successful governor of Upper Louisiana, which he certainly could have been, it's not impossible to believe that he would have risen to a much higher station in American life thereafter. But he had a difficult time, and I must say, although I say this with great sadness, Mr. Lewis developed a drinking problem, and he was not very conscientious in keeping in contact with me or the War Department. Something went wrong for Mr. Lewis in his return, and a man who had enormous potential failed, and as you know, he committed suicide on October 11th, 1809, a source of great grief to me personally and a great loss to this country.
Mr. Norton goes on to ask, he wonders, would Lewis have been able to complete his journal if he had not been given this appointment as governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory, and how would the rest of his life been different?
Well, that's a good question. So, some historians of your era have blamed me and said that if I had just kept him close and maybe supplied him with a staff, some researchers and some writers and so on, secretaries, amanuenses, that he might have then been able to finish the book because he would be unburdened by other duties. I take that criticism seriously, but here's why I did not follow that path. First of all, I wanted to reward him. But secondly, and this is, I think, maybe a character flaw in me, I was able to do what you call multitasking. It never occurred to me that he would not be able to serve as governor and write his book and do a wide range of other things. He started the first Masonic lodge west of the Mississippi River. He was interested in creating a school system there. He wanted to rewrite the entire law code of Upper Louisiana and continue to be a patron and guide, or at least advisor to other commercial and exploring missions for the Missouri River. And I assume that that as a protege of mine, he would be able to balance all of those tasks quite readily. It never occurred to me that the burdens of being the governor of Upper Louisiana would somehow get in the way of his finishing his book. If he had let me know that that was a burden, I would have found a way to relieve him. But he was very bad about communicating. If he had ever once said to me, "Mr. Jefferson, I'm overwhelmed. I don't think I'm going to be able to finish my book under these conditions. What do you suggest?" I would immediately have stepped in. The book about the journey, the 3-volume account that he intended to provide, was infinitely more important than a temporary governorship in a faraway province of a very small population base.
I want to thank James Norton for that question, and I should mention that he listens on KVPR in Fresno, California. I have another question, sir, from John Heath. In our day, there is a constant stream of information about the British monarchy. It seems the media and the citizens of the United States cannot stop their fascination with the royals.
Well, I suppose we're fascinated by zoos and menageries, too. I want to be very, very stern about this. I think that any American who spends any amount of time being fascinated with the British monarchy or the monarchy of any other country on earth is betraying the very concept of our republic. I once said if you took all of the crowned heads of all of the countries of Europe and melded them into a single individual, he would not deserve to be elected vestryman of the tiniest parish in Virginia.
Now, sir, these may be royals. They were born that way through no fault of their own, and they are people.
No, they begin as people, but they are so mollycoddled and so fattened on luxury and so removed from the actual business of life that they become exotics with no real concept of what it is for other human beings to live and work on earth.
We understand your point of view from your time and your perspective.
I continue, and I think anyone in your time who is a royal watcher should be ashamed of himself. He should be learning classical Greek. He should be reading the odes of Horace in Latin. He should be growing a petunia. He should be taking a walk in nature. He should be building a map or learning Spanish or writing notes about his own horticulture. But to waste a single moment of your time being fascinated with a monarchy is beyond my concept of what any rational human being would ever, under any circumstances,
Calm
do.
yourself, Mr. Jefferson.
I cannot be calm, sir.
Well, let me continue with his question. He goes on to say, there also seems to be a fear by many on the right that if we as a country worked at providing education, housing, and health care to our citizens, we would become a socialist country that would doom us. Our corporations gain more power over their employees each year. Corporate administrators earn more money while devaluing their workers at a steady rate. My question is, should we worry more about the return of the monarchy or the development of socialism?
One part of that really upset me. The idea that government could provide food or work or housing or health care to the American people.
Well, it provides defense.
That's a very different thing.
It controls trade.
That's an umpire's job.
It taxes the people and spends their money.
It should tax them as lightly as possible and with great hesitation and use that money for things that are absolutely required.
But all of those things are for the good of the people.
That's not the nature of a republic. That's another sort of government, and people are welcome to emigrate to other places that suit them better. But in the United States, people are responsible for their own welfare. You feed yourself. You clothe yourself. You shelter yourself. You manage your own life. Government has no role in this except as a distant umpire. And anytime government says, here's what I can do for you, citizen, we should run away in horror.
So citizens should stand independent and self-reliant.
Absolutely.
It's hard to argue against that, Mr. Jefferson.
Yes, I believe that the Creator devised us to be those who looked after their own welfare. In other words, if we lived on an island, if I were marooned on an island, the first thing that I would do, like Robinson Crusoe, would be to find shelter. And then I would look around and say, how am I going to feed myself? How am I going to protect myself from attack by savage animals or maybe savage individuals? I would do everything for myself. I would not depend upon anybody or any institution ever to provide for those basic needs. Now, national defense is another thing. When the British attacked us, the Minutemen rose up as a spontaneous militia to protect ourselves. And there may be times when we need to organize that more fully for our national defense. And we need a post office. That's something that should be done by the national government because it knits the country together. But the number of things that must be done by government is exceedingly few.
Let me pull you back and pin you down and get an answer to his final question, which is, should we worry more about the return of the monarchy or the development of socialism?
Well, if you have to choose between those two, your biggest concern should be the return of the monarchy because that's a form of tyranny.
Noted. Let's move on to another question, and I thank Mr. John Heath for the last one. This one comes from Chip Tranby. His question is, I would like to know more about Jefferson's family, primarily his brothers and sisters. I've always been interested in his sister Elizabeth and her possible handicap and death.
I had 8 siblings, one brother whose name was Randolph. He was born in 1755, so 12 years after my own birth. He was a good farmer, a good and decent man, not extraordinary in any way, and to a certain degree I had to supervise his finances and other matters in his life, but he was certainly capable of living entirely independently. My favorite sibling was my sister Jane, a beautiful musician, an extraordinary young woman, but she died in her 20s, and that loss to me was a really grievous one. She was my favorite sibling. She was the one that I had most in common with. I depended upon her friendship, and I felt really extraordinarily lost when she died at such a young age. I lived in an age before vaccination for the most part, and I lived in an age before antibiotics, certainly. And then this man is interested in my sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth was mentally deficient. She was never able to function on her own, and there was an earthquake in the early 1770s, and she was so frightened, so scared by what had happened that she went off away from our house and wandered into the woods, and we couldn't find her. We found her a few days later, and she had died, which was another great loss. But she was mentally handicapped and so really extraordinarily frightened by this earthquake that she left without supervision and then unfortunately died very young.
I'm sorry to ask you to recall those sad memories about your family, sir.
I said to Mrs. Cosway, I was born to lose everything that I loved. My favorite sister, Jane, my closest friend, Dabney Carr. He was just 33 years old at the time of his death. 4 of my 6 children before their 5th birthday, and a 5th, my daughter Mariah, who died in April of 1804 while I was serving as President of the United States. Loss and grief were central to my life, but I was an optimist nevertheless.
Well, sure, I hate to end our conversation on such a sad note. Perhaps you could take a walk in your garden and go back to where we began.
Putting your hands in the soil and seeing something grow that you have nurtured in that very miniature way is one of the most healing things that can ever happen in one's life.
Now, let's leave it there then, Mr. Jefferson. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
And welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, now out of wig and tights, and I'm sitting across from the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson. I don't see your office sign there here in the barn. Now I do. Semi-permanent guest host, Thomas Jefferson Hour, sent to you by a loving listener.
And much appreciated.
Indeed. Someday maybe I'll get one. I don't know.
What you were telling me, if I'm here 20 years, I get to be
permanent. Then we take semi-permanent off. What, you're down to, you
So
only did like 4 more years, right?
I'd be the semi-guest host.
No, you'd be the permanent guest host.
Oh, boy, I don't know if I could take that pressure.
Maybe we even take guest out, permanent host.
Good questions from listeners this week. We must start by thanking them. And
Two of my favorite subjects, David, the Lewis and Clark expedition, as you know, and gardening.
We got questions from, don't tell me, Rick Flint, Stephen the Heron, James Norton, Chip Tranby, and John Heath.
Excellent. Great questions. Send them in. The more the merrier. We love taking listener questions.
A couple we didn't get to that maybe you can just quickly address.
Certainly.
Cindy Jossert wrote in. It's a trivial one, but I have long been curious if Thomas Jefferson was familiar with Jane Austen and her work.
The answer seems to be no. She was writing about the time Jefferson was president. But
Doesn't really seem like he didn't read novels.
He wasn't a friend of novels. In fact, he once said that when he couldn't sleep, he would try to contemplate the plot of a mystery novel that he would write, and it would put him right to sleep. He thought that, this is going to sound pretty sexist, Cindy, but he thought that novels were best suited for hypochondriac women.
Well, yeah, but then there is that one, the Tristram
Shandy, his favorite novel,
which he and his wife,
and they loved it, and also Don Quixote, which
wasn't
he
there
said
a
was
deathbed quotation from that book?
She wrote out a passage from Tristram Shandy about the evanescence of time and so on, the certainty of death and dissolution, and then she couldn't finish, and Jefferson finished it with his stronger hand. It's a relic. It's in the rare books room at the library at the University of Virginia. But he wasn't. So far as we know, he never talks about Jane Austen. But he lived in a Jane Austen novel, as I frequently say. That world of super politeness where nobody ever said what they really thought, and people almost failed to join together in love and matrimony because they were being so superbly polite that they would never say, "Hey, I'm in love with you. You shouldn't marry that guy."
Okay, I got another one. This one comes from a listener who listens on KRCC. His name is Chuck Kidd, and he wants to know regarding the impeachment clause, the key phrase high crimes and misdemeanors would seem redundant or even contradictory in today's vernacular. Now, remember, he was presenting this question to President Jefferson, not you.
Right. Well, misdemeanor in our time means something much smaller than it meant in constitutional theory. And I'll say this, it might sound controversial, but I urge people to listen to Alan Dershowitz's statements during the impeachment trial, because he laid out, before he went off on the whole business of whether a chief executive can be impeached at all, but before that, he talked about the historical meaning of those phrases, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors, and he gave a brilliant, historically grounded analysis of what those terms meant in the age of James Madison and George Washington and Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. So all I can say at the moment is that misdemeanors were much graver violations of law in Jefferson's time than they are in our time, and there is redundancy here. So bribery, treason, and other high crimes and misdemeanors, that's a kind of a catchphrase meaning other really, really serious crimes that a president might commit are impeachable. And notice that the Founding Fathers did not say abuse of power. They should have. Jefferson certainly would have wanted them to say malfeasance, incompetence, abuse of power, but they didn't. They wrote the impeachment clause very narrowly, and Professor Dershowitz was right, and so was Jonathan Turley, in my opinion, by saying, look, we can impeach and convict if we want, but if you really want to stay within the clear meaning of the discourse of the Founding Fathers on this, they left you no room for abuse of power. They're talking about crime. And so you need to be able to establish a crime, and maybe you can, but you shouldn't impeach and convict for lesser abuses than that.
Okay, I have another one from Tom Morris. And again, this is for President Jefferson, but he's left the building. So what era of your life do you wish was properly told in a movie or TV miniseries? That's probably just as well that I didn't present that to Jefferson.
What's a miniseries?
Yeah. Similar to your good friend, President Adams. We both talked about that HBO series from
which
10 years ago. It's
absolutely
great.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Also, which actor alive or dead would you most like to portray you?
Well, Jefferson, this is a hard question.
He would never even answer this.
No, and I can't really answer it either. So Jefferson would not believe that his presidency was the main thing. I'm sure he would say the period between 1773 and 1780, but, with the central fact being his authorship of first a summary view, which was his run-up to the Declaration of Independence, and then the Declaration of Independence itself, and then, although somewhat boring to us, his revisal of the entire law code of Virginia, and culminating in 1786 in the passage in Virginia of the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty. Jefferson would certainly say that was the high water mark of his life and achievement, and the one of most important consequence for the history of human liberty. But he was not primarily a public figure. He really regarded himself as a private figure. And the part that I always find so fascinating is his retirement years, when he's this sort of fellow in slippers at Monticello, puttering in the garden and playing with his grandchildren and writing letters to John Adams. That's the part that I find the most human and compelling in Jefferson's personal life. Now, who should portray him?
I thought the guy who did it in Adams, Stephen Delane,
Yes.
he was pretty good.
Yeah, he seemed a little on the Asperger's track in the way that he portrayed Jefferson, which may be true.
The body
that kind of strange
positions,
body.
yeah.
And then I remember that scene where he sort of dressed like the Cat in the Hat. That was weird, but true. But here's what I think Jefferson would say, or I would say: not Nick Nolte, not Nick Nolte, not Nick Nolte.
Agreed. Now, before we go to your essay this week, something on a little more of a serious note. I mean, somebody has embarrassed my hometown by an act of vandalism against an artist because they disagreed with the person in the portrait, their political views. And it doesn't matter who it was as far as the person in the portrait or their political views. I'm against that kind of. We need to be able to speak freely and express ourselves. And so I'm really disappointed and a little ashamed of some of the citizens in my town.
I have to say, I think something that the President of the United States has licensed. He has licensed us to become our worst selves, whereas I think presidents need to invite us to become our best selves. And I really worry about that for the future of civility in this country. And the second thing I want to say about this is that North Dakota is an energy-producing state. We're the second most important energy-producing state after Texas. This is carbon country, and we are edgy about the climate debate. We shouldn't be. Science is science.
Well, I bring it up because I know that your essay this week touches on this. I'm hoping you can help me make some sense out of it. And with that, sir, it is now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
The silly controversy in Bismarck, North Dakota, over a local photographer's desire to mount a 7-foot-high portrait of the Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg on the outside wall of a downtown building comes just as we learn that Antarctica has experienced the 2 hottest days on historical record, and just when an iceberg the size of Malta has broken free from the Pine Island Glacier in western Antarctica. Fully 99% of the world's scientists agree that the Earth's climate is being seriously endangered by carbon emissions. Greta Thunberg, insisting on the fierce urgency of now, has become the poster child of a global children's crusade on climate, while her counterparts, including survivors of the Parkland school shooting in Florida, are leading a children's crusade to demand an end to gun violence, inhumane detention of immigrants and refugees, human trafficking, and obscene income inequality. Why can't we see Greta Thunberg for what she is, an idealistic young person from Europe who feels passionately that we are imperiling the planet with our industrial effluence, and that if we don't wake up now, it may be too late? Her youth, passion, articulateness, and haunting Nordic visage have won her international attention. She has addressed the United Nations. She has been featured on the cover of Time magazine. She addressed the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. And she has gotten under the skin of the President of the United States. Mr. Trump's response to her Cassandra-like call for immediate and urgent attention to the impending climate disaster? Quoting, "Greta must work on her anger management problem, then go to a good old-fashioned movie with a friend. Chill, Greta, chill." There's the American trajectory, from John F. Kennedy's "Ask not what your country can do for you" to Donald Trump's chill out, go to a movie. Shane Balkovich, the photographer, is a tremendously talented wet plate artist who has dedicated much of his recent life to making glass plate photographs of Native Americans, some of whom travel across the country to sit for his remarkable portraits. His detractors, the climate deniers of Bismarck, North Dakota, do not, I believe, constitute a majority of community opinion, but they are loud, angry, righteous, mean-spirited, and, of course, outraged. They're certainly entitled to boycott businesses that offend their prickly sensibilities and to pressure property owners to reject Mr. Balkovich's art. Boycotts are an important political tool, though why they would choose to punish the proprietors of a bakery who merely rent space from the owner of the building is hard to fathom. Logic is not one of their specialties. Now that the photographer has canceled his plans to inscribe Greta's image in Bismarck's downtown, the militant carbonistas will feel they have won a battle in the culture wars. But thanks to their protest, his superb portrait of Greta Thunberg will now grace buildings in Fargo, that haven of the left, and other cities across America. In fact, the Library of Congress has requested the original glass plate, Standing for Us All, for its permanent photographic archive, a fabulous honor for Mr. Balkovich, and one for which all North Dakotans should be proud. Thanks to the outcry, his artistry will gain increased and much-deserved national and international acclaim. Meanwhile, Greta's prominence will, if anything, increase thanks to the Bismarck protest. The angry irrationality of her detractors amplifies and augments the legitimacy of her environmental message, because if a lone 17-year-old could get under their skin so easily, she must be onto something. The best thing they could have done to show disagreement with her message is simply to ignore her. As North Dakota's most prominent conservative blogger put it, quote, "If you oppose Thunberg's economically illiterate rhetorical stylings as much as I do, the last thing you should want to do is lend her cause a veneer of false credibility by turning her into a martyr." The world is slowly but surely moving away from its near-total addiction to carbon. Reasonable people are right to be skeptical about how soon and how completely we can transcend an energy paradigm that has helped feed the world, create great if uneven global prosperity, liberate billions from backbreaking labor, send humans to the moon, and give many hundreds of millions of people unprecedented comfort, mobility, and security. But the simple truth is that the United States is going to be at least significantly post-carbon before North Dakota's supply of carbon runs out. We need to begin thinking about that post-carbon world now, not when the national and world economies walk away from the carbon treasury under our feet. Even if you disagree with Greta Thunberg's formula for the future, her clarion call to action and debate is worth considering seriously. What is all the fuss really about? If someone put up a mural in downtown Bismarck of Sarah Palin saying, "Drill, baby, drill," I certainly wouldn't boycott the business that happened to be housed in that landlord's building. How can that be fair? And I wouldn't protest the mural either. Free speech is one of the central principles of American life. There was for a long time a hand-painted sign in East Jenkinson, my hometown, saying, "White Lives Matter." Although I thought that statement moronic, I didn't lose any sleep over it, any more than when I saw a sign in western Nebraska during the Obama years saying, "Don't blame me, I voted for the American." A robust democracy needs robust debate. Take some time to study the photograph. A solemn young woman stands on the Great Plains looking off camera. This is not exactly Andre Serrano's infamous 1987 Piss Christ photo, or AP photographer Nick Utz's 1972 image of a naked Vietnamese girl fleeing a napalm attack. It's a beautiful photograph of a beautiful and determined child. I'm with Voltaire and the principles of the Enlightenment, which gave birth to the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Voltaire is reported to have said, "Madam, I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Why don't the Greta detractors write op-ed pieces about the wrongness of her point of view, about the myth of climate change, about the importance of continued carbon extraction in North Dakota and beyond? Denouncing her as a misled kid who's being used by eco-terrorists, as one local commentator has done, is just throwing phrases rather than rational arguments at the climate issue. Misled by whom? The Bismarck, North Dakota controversy may seem to be about climate, But the real energy of the detractors is a lingering anger over the DAPL pipeline crisis of 2017. If Greta had been photographed in Theodore Roosevelt National Park rather than on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation, it is unlikely that matters would have boiled over as they have done. To the extent that the great mural controversy is about climate change, the culture of outrage can deny the truth, but it cannot make it go away. First, evidence of human-generated climate change is everywhere around us, and things are getting worse, not better. The great majority of nations accepts the truth. They look on the scientific illiteracy of the United States with sadness and bewilderment. Only in America can a United States senator hold up a snowball on the floor of the Senate and say, well, there's your climate change. Other nations and their governments are working with discipline to reduce their carbon footprint. In fact, Europeans have found that moving towards a greener society is highly profitable from a business point of view and leads to important breakthroughs in non-carbon technologies. Second, although Greta Thunberg has become a somewhat improbable poster child for this global movement, presidential bullying and ad hominem attacks will not make her or the movement go away. Just the opposite. They are an indication of her credibility and the growing consensus, even here in the United States, that global warming must not be ignored any longer. I want you to panic, Greta has said. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day, and then I want you to act. Everyone who values art, freedom of expression, robust democracy, and the search for truth needs to speak out in this controversy. The majority of people who stand for good sense, tolerance, generosity of spirit, and who are unthreatened by serious democratic debate need to take back North Dakota from those who would close our borders to refugees, punish the Lakota for asserting their rights and their legitimate environmental concerns, and who would shout down or vandalize artists whose work they cannot be bothered to refute with rational argument. In other words, we need to be pro-art, pro-speech, and pro-Shane Balkovich. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.